The morning of October 15th, 1997, dawned gray and cold in the small town of Millbrook Valley, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. A thick fog clung to the hollows like ghostly fingers, and the air carried the sharp bite of autumn that promised an early winter. In 12 hours, 17 children would vanish without a trace, leaving behind only questions that would haunt a community for nearly 3 decades. Delilah Rodriguez adjusted her rearview mirror for the third time, watching the empty road behind her yellow school bus stretch into the morning mist. At 42, she had been driving Route 47 for 8 years, navigating the winding mountain roads that connected the scattered homes of Millbrook Valley's most remote families. She knew every pothole, every sharp curve, every family that depended on her to safely transport their most precious cargo to Cedar Ridge Elementary and back. The bus route was infamous among drivers for its treacherous terrain. State Road 47 snaked through 15 miles of dense forest, crossing 3 narrow bridges over rushing mountain streams, climbing elevation that left ears popping, and descending into valleys so deep that radio signals often cut out entirely. Most drivers avoided the route, but Delilah had volunteered for it specifically because she understood these mountain families. She had grown up here herself, in a cabin without running water, walking 4 miles to school until she was old enough to drive. As she pulled up to the first stop, the Hutchinson farm, Delilah could see 8-year-old Ezra already waiting by the weathered mailbox, his backpack nearly as big as he was. His older sister, Tamara, 16 and fiercely protective, stood beside him with her arms crossed against the cold. The Hutchinson kids had been riding Delilah's bus since their father, a coal miner, had been injured in a cave-in 2 years earlier. Their mother, Priscilla, worked double shifts at the diner in town to keep food on the table. "Morning, you two," Delilah called as the pneumatic doors hissed open. "How's your daddy feeling?" "Better," Tamara replied, though her tired eyes suggested otherwise. She helped Ezra up the steep steps, then slid into a seat near the front where she could watch over him. Delilah made a mental note to save some of her lunch money to slip to Tamara later. The girl never asked for help, but Delilah knew pride didn't fill empty stomachs. The next stop brought twins Jasper and Juniper Caldwell, 10 years old and inseparable. Their grandmother, Maxine, had been raising them since their parents died in a car accident 3 years earlier. The old woman stood at the end of her gravel driveway, waving with one hand while clutching a thermos of coffee with the other. Even from a distance, Delilah could see the worry lines etched deep in Maxine's weathered face. The woman lived in constant fear that something would happen to the only family she had left. As the twins climbed aboard, chattering excitedly about a science project involving homemade volcanoes, Delilah felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. These weren't just passengers, they were someone's whole world. The route continued deeper into the mountains, collecting children like precious stones. 13-year-old Knox Patterson, whose mother had died in childbirth and whose father spent more time at the bottom of a bottle than at home. 9-year-old Iris McMullen, brilliant and curious, who devoured library books faster than the tiny Cedar Ridge branch could order them. The Velasquez siblings, Maria, age 15, and her brothers Diego and Pablo, ages 11 and 7, whose parents worked 16-hour days at the chicken processing plant and relied on Maria to mother her younger brothers. By the time Delilah reached the final cluster of stops, her bus held 17 children, ranging in age from 7 to 16. They came from families that scraped by on whatever work they could find: coal mining, logging, small farming, or the occasional odd job in town. These kids understood hardship in ways that children shouldn't have to, but they also possessed a resilience and loyalty that constantly amazed Delilah. As the bus wound its way through the forest toward Cedar Ridge Elementary, the children settled into their usual routines. The older kids helped younger ones with homework, shared breakfast bars when someone forgot to eat, and kept watch over the little ones like protective siblings. Tamara was quizzing Ezra on his multiplication tables. Maria was braiding 7-year-old Autumn Briggs' hair, Knox, despite his tough exterior, was patiently helping Iris with a crossword puzzle. The radio crackled with static as they climbed toward Dead Man's Pass, the highest point on the route. This was normal. The mountains interfered with everything from radio signals to cellular towers. The few residents who could afford car phones found them useless in these valleys. Even the school's radio system often cut out during the most remote sections of various routes. Buzz 47 to dispatch. Delilah spoke into her handset as they crested the pass. Static was her only response. She tried again. Nothing. Standard procedure dictated that she should report the radio malfunction when she reached the school. But the radios always worked fine once they descended into the valley where Cedar Ridge sat. What Delilah couldn't know was that this morning, communication failures were the least of her worries. At exactly 7:43 a.m., as her bus descended the winding switchbacks toward the school, something extraordinary and terrifying was about to unfold. The children, lost in their conversations and morning drowsiness, didn't notice when the landscape outside began to change subtly. The familiar landmarks, the old Miller barn, the abandoned gas station, the creek bridge covered in morning frost, all seemed somehow different, as if viewed through a lens that slightly altered reality. Delilah first noticed something was wrong when she glanced at her odometer. After 8 years of driving this route, she knew it was exactly 18.7 miles from her first pickup to the school. But the odometer showed they had traveled nearly 23 miles and she could see no familiar landmarks ahead. The road stretched before them, identical to State Road 47 in every way except that it led somewhere it had never led before. The yellow lines were the same, the guardrails identical, even the mile markers matched what she expected to see. But the forest on either side seemed deeper, darker, and utterly unknown. "Kids," Delilah called back, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. "Anybody recognize where we are?" The children looked out the windows with curiosity rather than concern. To them, this was just another mountain road. But Tamara, who had been riding this route for years, frowned as she studied the scenery. "This doesn't look right," she said quietly. "Where's the fire tower? We should be able to see the fire tower from here." Delilah's blood ran cold. The fire tower was a landmark visible from nearly every point on their route's descent. Built in the 1960s, it stood 150 feet tall and was painted bright red and white. On a clear day like this, it should have been impossible to miss, yet the horizon showed nothing but endless forest canopy. She pressed harder on the brake as they approached what should have been the final curve before Cedar Ridge came into view. The bus rounded the bend, and Delilah's heart nearly stopped. Instead of the familiar sight of the small town's water tower and the elementary school's red brick building, the road simply continued. It stretched ahead into more forest, more mountains, more of the same terrain they had been traveling through for the past hour. "Mrs. Rodriguez?" Iris's voice was small and uncertain. "Are we lost?" The question hung in the air like morning mist. Delilah pulled the bus to a stop at a small turnout, her hands shaking as she reached for the radio. Static. She tried adjusting the frequency, checking the power connection, even smacking the side of the unit as her father had taught her to do with stubborn electronics. Nothing but static. "Okay, kids, everybody stay calm," she announced, though her own voice betrayed her growing panic. "We are just taking a little detour this morning. Probably some construction or something blocking the usual route." She had no explanation for how she could have taken a detour without noticing, or how construction could have appeared overnight on a road she had driven just yesterday. But the alternative, that something impossible was happening, was too frightening to consider. Delilah put the bus in reverse, intending to backtrack until she found familiar ground. But as she checked her mirrors, her blood turned to ice. The road behind them, the same road they had just traveled, was gone. In its place was a wall of dense forest, as if the pavement had simply ceased to exist the moment they passed over it. The children were beginning to notice that something was seriously wrong. The younger ones started to whimper, while the older kids moved protectively closer to their younger siblings or friends. Knox Patterson, trying to maintain his tough guy image, peered out the back window and went pale. "Lady," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "The road's gone." Delilah stepped outside the bus, leaving the engine running and the heater on for the children. The October air bit at her skin, but she barely noticed. She walked to the rear of the bus and stared in disbelief at what Knox had seen. Dense pine trees and mountain laurel grew where, moments before, there had been a paved road. The vegetation looked ancient, as if it had been undisturbed for decades. She circled the bus, examining their surroundings with growing desperation. They were parked on a perfectly normal section of mountain highway, complete with yellow lines, reflective markers, and even a speed limit sign. But it was a road that existed in isolation, a perfect stretch of pavement floating in a sea of wilderness with no connection to anywhere else. The GPS unit mounted on her dashboard, a new addition that year, purchased by the school district after several accidents on mountain routes, showed only a blank screen. No satellite signal, no map, no indication of their location. The device displayed an error message she had never seen before. Location unknown, no reference points found. As Delilah stared at the impossible scene around them, a new fear began to creep into her mind. In 8 years of driving these mountains, she had heard the old stories whispered in the diner and the general store. Tales passed down through generations of mountain families about places in the deep woods where people simply vanished. The old-timers called them thin places, spots where the boundary between the known world and something else became permeable. She had always dismissed such stories as mountain folklore, the kind of tales that grew in isolated communities where people had too much time to imagine horrors in the wilderness. But standing here, surrounded by an impossible landscape, those dismissed stories suddenly seemed less like folklore and more like warnings. Back inside the bus, the children had organized themselves instinctively. The older kids had gathered the younger ones into the front seats, creating a protective circle. Maria Velasquez was softly singing a Spanish lullaby to calm her youngest brother, Pablo, while Tamara held Ezra close and stroked his hair. Even Knox had abandoned his usual seat in the back to help comfort the scared children. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Tamara said when Delilah climbed back aboard. "What's happening to us?" The question demanded an answer that Delilah didn't have. How could she explain something that defied explanation? How could she tell these children that they appeared to be trapped in a place that shouldn't exist, on a road that led nowhere and came from nowhere? "I don't know, sweetheart," she admitted, her honesty perhaps more comforting than false reassurances would have been. "But I promise you this, we are going to figure it out together, and we are all going to get home safely." She looked at her watch. 8:15 a.m. The school bell would ring in 15 minutes, and 17 children would be marked absent. By 9 a.m. worried teachers would call the school office. By 9:30 the principal would try to radio bus. By 10 a.m. when there was still no response, searchers would be dispatched. But they would be looking in all the wrong places, following all the right roads, searching a world that Bus 47 was no longer part of. As the morning wore on, Delilah tried everything she could think of. She attempted to drive forward, only to find that the road ahead simply ended after another mile, terminating in the same impenetrable wall of ancient forest. She tried to walk into the woods, hoping to find a hiking trail or hunting path that might lead back to civilization. But the underbrush was so thick and the terrain so steep that she couldn't make it more than a few yards. The children, meanwhile, displayed the remarkable adaptability that had helped them survive hardship all their lives. They shared the snacks from their backpacks, rationing them carefully. They played quiet games to keep the younger ones distracted. They took turns keeping watch at the windows, searching for any sign of rescue or escape. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky and their situation remained unchanged, a grim reality began to settle over the bus. They weren't just lost. They were somewhere that lost didn't adequately describe. They were displaced, removed from the world they knew, and deposited in a place that existed outside normal geography. At 11:47 a.m., nearly 4 hours after they should have arrived at school, something finally changed. Iris, who had been staring intently out the side window, suddenly grabbed Delilah's arm. "Look," she whispered, pointing toward the tree line. "There's someone watching us." Delilah followed the girl's gaze and felt her heart skip a beat. Deep in the shadows between the pine trees, barely visible, was a figure. Human-shaped but wrong somehow, standing perfectly still at the edge of the forest. The figure was too far away to make out details, but something about its posture, its unnatural stillness, sent chills down Delilah's spine. "Kids, move away from the windows," she ordered, her voice sharp with authority. "Everybody to the center of the bus, now." As the children huddled together in the aisle, Delilah kept her eyes fixed on the figure in the trees. It didn't move, didn't wave, didn't show any signs of life except for its presence. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only minutes, the figure simply faded back into the shadows, leaving Delilah to wonder if she had imagined it entirely. But Iris had seen it too, and the girl's frightened eyes confirmed that whatever they had witnessed was real. As the afternoon shadows grew longer, more figures began to appear at the forest's edge. Never more than one or two at a time, never close enough to see clearly, but always watching. The children, following Delilah's instructions, stayed away from the windows, but the older ones took turns keeping careful watch, reporting the watchers' movements in hushed whispers. The figures never approached the bus, never made any threatening gestures, but their presence transformed the already surreal situation into something actively menacing. These weren't lost hikers or curious locals. There was something fundamentally wrong about the way they moved or didn't move, and the unnatural stillness with which they observed the trapped bus. As darkness began to fall on October 15, 1997, Delilah faced a terrible decision. The bus's fuel gauge showed less than a quarter tank. Running the engine for heat and lighting was depleting their reserves. But the mountain air was growing cold, and she had 17 children depending on her to keep them safe. She made the choice to conserve fuel, shutting off the engine, except for brief periods to warm the bus. The children bundled together for warmth, sharing jackets and blankets that some had brought for outdoor recess. In the growing darkness, with only emergency lighting illuminating the interior, Bus 47 became a small island of humanity in an ocean of unknown dangers. Outside, the watchers had multiplied. Delilah could see their silhouettes against the star-filled sky, scattered throughout the forest like sentinels. They maintained their distance, but their numbers suggested organization, purpose, intelligence. They weren't random observers, they were guards. As the first night of their captivity settled over the 17 children and their driver, none of them could have imagined that this was only the beginning. They couldn't know that 27 years would pass before anyone would understand what had happened to Bus 47, or that the truth, when it finally emerged, would challenge everything humanity believed about the nature of reality itself. In the distance, barely audible over the mountain wind, came a sound that made every person on the bus freeze in terror. It was the sound of children singing, voices raised in a haunting melody that seemed to come from every direction at once. But these weren't the voices of any children who should have been in these mountains. These voices belonged to something else entirely, something that wore the shape of childhood like a mask. The song continued through the night, a lullaby that promised sleep but delivered only nightmares, sung by a choir that existed somewhere between the world the children knew and a place that human maps had never charted. Tomorrow would bring new horrors, new impossibilities, and the beginning of a transformation that would change the 17 children of Bus 47 in ways that would take 27 years for the FBI to understand. But tonight, huddled together in the darkness, they were still just scared children lost in a place that shouldn't exist, watched by things that shouldn't be, and slowly beginning to realize that their old lives were as gone as the road that had brought them here. The last entry in Delilah Rodriguez's logbook, found years later in the abandoned bus, was written in increasingly shaky handwriting. Day 1, 17 children safe. Radio dead. Road gone. Watchers in the trees. God help us all. She had no way of knowing that this would be the last coherent record of Boss 47's fate, or that the next 27 years would transform those 17 children into something that would challenge the very foundations of human understanding when they were finally found. Dawn broke gray and lifeless over Boss 47, filtering through windows fogged with the breath of 18 terrified souls. The haunting melody that had tormented them through the night had finally ceased with the first pale light, leaving behind a silence that somehow felt more ominous than the phantom choir had been. Delilah Rodriguez hadn't slept. She had maintained her vigil at the driver's seat, watching the tree line for any movement, any sign that the watchers had withdrawn with the darkness. But as morning light revealed the forest around them, her worst fears were confirmed. The figures were still there, more numerous than before, standing motionless between the pine trunks like scarecrows forgotten by their makers. Behind her, the children were beginning to stir. Young Pablo Velasquez whimpered in his sleep, caught in dreams that Delilah hoped were less terrible than their waking reality. His sister Maria held him close, her own exhausted face showing the strain of trying to be strong for her brothers while fighting her own terror. Mrs. Rodriguez. Tamara's voice was barely above a whisper. The 16-year-old had positioned herself near the front, serving as an unofficial guardian for the younger children. How many of them are there now? Delilah counted silently, her blood chilling with each motionless figure she identified in the forest. 37 that I can see, she replied quietly, maybe more deeper in the trees. The number was staggering. When the watchers had first appeared yesterday, there had been perhaps 6 or 7 scattered throughout the woods. Now they formed an almost complete circle around the bus, maintaining their distance but clearly establishing a perimeter. The message was unmistakable. The bus and its occupants weren't just lost, they were being contained. Knox Patterson, who had spent the night trying to protect his reputation as the tough kid while secretly terrified, crawled forward from where he had been huddled with the younger children. His usual bravado was completely gone, replaced by a vulnerability that made him look far younger than his 13 years. "What do they want with us?" he asked, his voice cracking. It was the question that had haunted Delilah through the sleepless night. The watchers' behavior suggested intelligence, purpose, coordination. They weren't mindless creatures acting on instinct. They were implementing a plan, following orders or pursuing some objective that required keeping the bus trapped in this impossible place. "I don't know, honey," Delilah admitted. "But whatever they want, we are not going to make it easy for them." As the morning progressed, the children's resilience continued to amaze her. Despite their fear, they organized themselves with the efficiency born of hardship. The older kids took responsibility for the younger ones, sharing water bottles and the remaining snacks with careful rationing. Iris McMullen, the bookish 9-year-old, had appointed herself the group's chronicler, using a composition notebook to record everything that happened. Her detailed observations would prove crucial in ways none of us could imagine. "Day 2, she wrote in her careful cursive. "The singing stopped when the sun came up. There are more watchers now. They look like people, but they don't move like people. Mrs. Rodriguez says we need to stay calm, but I can tell she's scared too. The road is still gone behind us. I think we are in a place that isn't supposed to exist." At 9 years old, Iris had articulated what the adults were struggling to accept. They weren't just geographically displaced. They were ontologically displaced, existing in a space that operated by different rules than the world they knew. The fuel situation was becoming critical. Delilah had been running the engine in brief intervals to provide heat, but the gauge now showed less than an eighth of a tank. October in the mountains could see temperatures drop below freezing at night, and she had 17 children depending on her to keep them alive. More troubling was their water situation. The children had brought small drinks for lunch, but those were nearly exhausted. Delilah had spotted a stream through the trees, perhaps a quarter mile from the road. but reaching it would mean leaving the safety of the bus and venturing into the domain of the Watchers. At midday, when the sun was highest and the Watchers seemed to retreat slightly deeper into the forest shadows, Delilah made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "I'm going to try to reach that stream," she announced to the older children. "We need water, and this might be our best chance." "No." Tamara's protest was immediate and fierce. "You can't leave us alone with those things out there." "She's right," added Maria, clutching her youngest brother protectively. "What if you don't come back? What if they are waiting for you to leave the bus?" The debate revealed the impossible nature of their situation. Stay together and die of thirst, or risk separation in a place where normal rules didn't apply. Delilah was still wrestling with the decision when 10-year-old Jasper Caldwell made it for her. "There," he said, pointing out the window toward the forest. "Something's coming." Through the trees, moving with an unnatural gliding motion, came one of the Watchers. Unlike the others, this one was approaching the bus directly, showing no hesitation or caution. As it drew closer, details became horrifyingly clear. The figure appeared to be a woman, tall and pale, wearing a dress that might have been fashionable decades earlier. Her hair hung long and dark around a face that was beautiful in the way that marble statues were beautiful, perfect, cold, and utterly lifeless. But it was her eyes that sent terror through every person on the bus. They were completely black, not just the irises, but the entire visible eye, as if she were looking at them through windows into an infinite void. She stopped exactly 10 feet from the bus door and stood motionless, her black gaze fixed on the windows. When she spoke, her voice somehow penetrated the bus's metal walls as if they weren't there at all. "Children," she said, and her voice was like honey poured over broken glass. "You must be so frightened, so hungry, so thirsty." The younger children began to cry, instinctively pressing themselves against the older kids. Even Knox was trembling, all pretense of toughness abandoned in the face of something that violated every natural law. "I can help you," the woman continued, never moving, never blinking. "I can give you everything you need. Food, water, warmth, safety. All you have to do is come outside, just for a moment. Just to talk." Delilah found her voice, though it came out as a harsh croak. "Stay away from these children." The woman's head turned toward her with a movement that was too smooth, too fluid, like a doll's head on a pivot. When she smiled, her teeth were perfect white pearls in a mouth that seemed too wide for her face. "Dear Delilah," she said, and the use of her name sent ice through the driver's veins. "You have done such a good job protecting them, but you are so tired. Wouldn't you like to rest? Wouldn't you like someone else to take care of everything?" The temptation in her voice was like a physical force. Despite every instinct screaming danger, Delilah found herself reaching for the door handle. The offer of relief, of someone else bearing the crushing responsibility, was almost irresistible after the terror and exhaustion of the past day. It was Ezra Hutchinson who saved them all. The 8-year-old, who had been silent since yesterday morning, suddenly spoke in a voice far older and wiser than his years. "She's lying," he said simply. "She smells like the old mine shaft where the bad things happened." The spell broke. Delilah jerked her hand away from the door handle, while the pale woman's beautiful facade flickered for just an instant, revealing something underneath that was neither beautiful nor human. The glimpse lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough to show teeth too sharp, skin too pale, and a hunger that had nothing to do with food. "Clever little boy," the woman said, her voice now carrying an undertone of something that might have been amusement or might have been threat. "Very clever indeed, but cleverness won't save you forever. This place has rules, and you are already beginning to learn them." She gestured to the forest around them, where the other Watchers had emerged from the deeper shadows. There were dozens of them now, perhaps hundreds, all maintaining their perfect stillness and their silent vigil. "You see, children, this place doesn't like to let go of visitors. Every day you remain. Every hour you breathe this air. Every drop of water you drink from these streams, you become a little more ours, a little less yours. Iris, still clutching her composition notebook, was furiously scribbling down every word. Her young mind, trained by years of voracious reading, was cataloging details that would later prove crucial. The woman's speech patterns, her archaic clothing, the way she moved, all clues to the nature of their prison. "What do you want from us?" Tamara demanded, surprising everyone with her courage. The woman's black gaze fixed on the teenager with something that might have been approval. "Such spirit, such fire. That's good. It makes the process more interesting. What do we want? We want what we have always wanted, child. We want you to stay. We want you to become part of this place as others have before you." Others? Delilah couldn't stop herself from asking. The woman's smile widened impossibly. "Oh yes, dear Delilah. Did you think you were the first? This place has been collecting special children for longer than your kind has walked these mountains. Children who understand hardship, who know survival, who possess the strength necessary for transformation." She raised one pale hand and pointed toward the deeper forest, where the watchers stood in their silent ranks. They were all children once. Lost children, forgotten children. Children whose disappearance would be blamed on wild animals or unfortunate accidents. But here they found purpose. Here they found forever. The implications hit the bus like a physical blow. The watchers weren't guardians or captors. They were previous victims, children who had been transformed into something else, conscripted into an army of the lost. The perfect stillness, the unnatural movements, the way they watched without blinking. They had once been children like the ones huddled in terror on bus. "No," Maria whispered, holding her brothers closer. "No, that's not going to happen to us." "Oh, but it is, sweet Maria," the woman replied, again demonstrating her impossible knowledge of their names. "It's already begun. Haven't you noticed how different you all feel today? How the colors seem brighter, how you can hear things you have never heard before?" Delilah's blood ran cold as she realized the woman was right. She had been so focused on the external threats that she hadn't noticed the subtle changes occurring within the bus. The children's eyes were sharper, more alert. Their hearing had become more acute. They were picking up sounds from the forest that should have been inaudible at this distance. Even their skin seemed to have taken on a subtle luminescence in the dim light. "The transformation is gradual," the woman continued, as if discussing the weather. "A gift, really. You will become stronger, faster, more resilient. You will never feel hunger or thirst again. You will never know fear or pain. All you have to sacrifice is your humanity." Knox Patterson, whose tough exterior had been completely stripped away, found his voice. How long does it take? For children as strong as you? 7 days, usually. Sometimes less if they fight it. Sometimes more if they are particularly stubborn. The woman's black gaze swept across the bus windows. "Today is day 2. You have perhaps 5 days left to be fully yourselves." Iris looked up from her frantic note-taking. "What happens on day 7? On day 7, sweet child, you will no longer want to leave. You will understand that this is where you belong. You will take your place among the watchers, and you will help us welcome the next group of lost children who stumble into our domain." The casual way she described their fate was perhaps more terrifying than any threat could have been. This wasn't malice or cruelty. It was simply the natural order of this place, as inevitable as sunrise or the changing season. "And if we refuse?" Delilah asked, though she dreaded the answer. The woman tilted her head with that unnaturally smooth motion. "Refuse? Oh dear Delilah. After day 7, the concept of refusal simply won't occur to you. You will be home." She began to retreat toward the forest, her movement that same unnatural glide that defied normal locomotion. "Enjoy your remaining days, children. Try to hold on to yourselves as long as you can. The memories of who you were will make the transformation all the sweeter." As she disappeared into the shadows, The other watchers also withdrew, though their presence could still be felt like a pressure against the windows of the bus. The children sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of their situation. They weren't just lost. They were being deliberately transformed into something inhuman, and they had perhaps 5 days left to prevent it. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Tamara said quietly, "is she telling the truth? Can that really happen to us?" Delilah wanted to offer reassurance, to tell them it was impossible, that such things didn't happen in the real world. But they were no longer in the real world, and the subtle changes she could feel in her own body suggested that the woman's words were horrifyingly accurate. "I don't know," she admitted, "but whatever happens, we are not going to give up. We are going to fight this thing with everything we have." As the day wore on, the children began to notice more changes. Their senses were becoming hyperacute. They could hear the heartbeats of small animals in the forest, smell the individual scents of different tree species, see details in the shadows that should have been invisible. Pablo Velázquez, the 7-year-old who had been too frightened to speak, suddenly announced that he could taste colors. "The green tastes like singing," he said matter-of-factly, looking at the pine trees, "and the brown tastes like sleeping." Maria held her youngest brother closer, tears streaming down her face as she realized that whatever was happening to them was accelerating. The innocence that made children adaptable was also making them vulnerable to this place's influence. By evening, when the haunting chorus of children's voices began again in the distance, several of the children on the bus had begun humming along unconsciously. They caught themselves and stopped, horrified. But the seed had been planted. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was psychological, emotional, spiritual. Iris continued her documentation, though her handwriting was becoming strange, occasionally slipping into symbols and patterns that resembled no human language. When Delilah pointed this out, the girl looked at her notebook in confusion. "I don't remember writing those parts," she admitted, "but somehow I know what they mean." As night fell on their second day in the impossible place, Delilah made a desperate decision. She gathered the 17 children around her and spoke words that would echo through the next 25 years. "Listen to me, all of you. I need you to promise me something. No matter what happens, no matter how you change or what you become, I need you to remember who you were. Remember your families, your homes, your lives before this place. Promise me you will hold on to that, even if everything else changes." One by one, the children made the promise. Even little Pablo, who was already seeing colors that didn't exist, solemnly swore to remember his mom and papa. It was a promise that would prove both salvation and torment in the years to come. As the transformation took hold and their humanity began to slip away, that core of memory would remain, buried deep but never truly lost. It would be the key that would eventually lead to their discovery and to revelations that would shake the foundations of everything the FBI thought they knew about missing persons cases. But that night, huddled together in Bus 47, as the phantom children's choir grew louder and more hypnotic, they were still recognizably human, still themselves, still fighting. They had 5 days left. Day 3 dawned with an unnatural beauty that should have been a warning. The forest around Bus 47 sparkled with a luminescence that had nothing to do with morning dew, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with colors that existed at the edge of human perception. The children woke to find that their world had become more vivid, more alive, and infinitely more dangerous. Delilah Rodriguez barely recognized her reflection in the bus's rearview mirror. Her brown eyes had developed flecks of silver that seemed to move with their own inner light, and her dark hair had gained strands of the same metallic sheen. But it was the expression on her face that disturbed her most. There was a serenity there that felt foreign, as if something else was learning to wear her features. The changes in the children were more pronounced. Ezra Hutchinson, the 8-year-old who had been small for his age, had grown noticeably taller overnight. His sister Tamara moved with a fluid grace that was beautiful and unsettling. her every gesture flowing like water. The twins, Jasper and Juniper Caldwell, had begun speaking in perfect unison without realizing they were doing it, their thoughts apparently synchronizing as their transformation progressed. Most disturbing of all was the change in their emotional states. The terror that had gripped them for the past 2 days was fading, replaced by a peculiar calm that Delilah recognized as profoundly wrong. Fear was a survival mechanism, and its absence in their situation was like losing a vital sense. "I had the most wonderful dream," announced 9-year-old Iris McMullen, her composition notebook forgotten in her lap. "I dreamed I could fly through the trees and speak with the wind. It felt so real, so right." Diego Velasquez, 11 years old, and usually protective of his younger siblings, nodded dreamily. "I dreamed I was made of starlight. I could see everything, the whole forest, other places like this one, children who have been here for hundreds of years." Delilah's blood chilled. These weren't just dreams, they were glimpses of what the children were becoming. The transformation was accelerating, moving beyond the physical into realms of consciousness and identity that she couldn't begin to understand. Knox Patterson, who had spent 3 days trying to maintain some semblance of his tough guy persona, approached her with a vulnerability that broke her heart. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I can hear them calling to me. The voices in the forest. They are singing my name, and it sounds like coming home." The Phantom Children's Choir had evolved throughout the night, becoming more sophisticated, more compelling. Where once it had been an alien and terrifying sound, it now carried melodies that seemed designed specifically for each child on the bus. Knox's name was indeed being sung, woven into harmonies that promised belonging, acceptance, an end to the hardships that had defined his young life. "You have to fight it, honey," Delilah urged, though she could hear the desperation in her own voice. "Remember what you promised. Remember who you are." But even as she spoke the words, she could feel her own memories becoming slippery, less substantial. Her childhood in these same mountains was fading like a photograph left in sunlight. The faces of her own family were becoming harder to recall, replaced by new memories that felt ancient and eternal. It was Iris who made the discovery that would change everything they thought they knew about their situation. Despite the dreamy changes affecting her mind, her natural curiosity remained intact. While the others were lost in their transforming thoughts, she had been exploring the bus with increasingly enhanced senses. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she called out, her voice strange and melodious. "There's something hidden under your seat." Delilah followed the girl's pointing finger to a section of the driver's seat where the vinyl had come loose. With her newly sensitive fingers, she could feel the edge of something hard and flat concealed beneath the upholstery. She worked it free and found herself holding a metal plate, tarnished with age but still legible. The plate bore an inscription that made her heart stop. "Boss 23, Millbrook Valley School District, retired." "That's impossible," she whispered. "This bus was manufactured in 1995. I have seen the paperwork." But as she examined the plate more closely, more details emerged. Scratched into the metal in a child's desperate handwriting were names and dates. Tommy Morrison, October 1952. Jenny Lake, October 1953. Billy Crawford, October 1950. The list went on, name after name spanning decades. All October dates, all children's names. And at the bottom, in fresher scratches that looked recent, Ezra Hutchinson. The implications were staggering. Bus 47 wasn't just trapped in this place. It was the same bus that had been trapping children for nearly half a century. The vehicle itself was part of the mechanism, a lure that appeared in different forms to match different eras, but always serving the same purpose. "How many?" Tamara asked, her enhanced vision allowing her to read the names from across the bus. Her voice was still her own, but there was something else there now, an otherworldly resonance that made the air shimmer. Delilah counted with growing horror. 43 names. 43 children over 45 years. The pale woman's words from the previous day took on new meaning. This place hadn't just collected the 17 children of Bus 47, it had been harvesting lost children for generations, each group adding to the ranks of the watchers in the forest. Maria Velasquez, still clutching her youngest brother Pablo, spoke with a wisdom that belonged to someone far older. We are not the first, and we won't be the last, unless we find a way to break the cycle. As if summoned by her words, the pale woman materialized at the edge of the forest, but she was no longer alone. With her came a procession of children from different eras, some wearing clothes from the 1950s, others from the 1960s and 1970s. All moved with that same unnatural grace. All bore the same black eyes. All radiated the same beautiful emptiness. The woman approached the bus with her gliding walk, stopping at her usual distance. When she spoke, her voice carried new undertones of authority and ancient power. "Day 3, she announced unnecessarily. "How beautifully you are all changing. Can you feel it? The way your old limitations are falling away? The way you are becoming something greater than merely human." Knox stepped forward, his transformation making him bold in ways that his original personality never had. "How long have you been doing this? How many children have you stolen?" The woman's smile was radiant and terrible. "Stolen? Oh dear Knox, we don't steal children. We save them. Every child who comes here was already lost, already forgotten, already abandoned by a world that had no place for them." She gestured to the ranks of transformed children behind her. "Tommy Morrison was an orphan who froze to death in an alley in 1952. We gave him eternal warmth. Jenny Lake was dying of tuberculosis when she found us. We gave her perfect health. Billy Crawford was beaten every day by a drunken father. We gave him peace." Each name she spoke was accompanied by a slight movement from the corresponding child in her entourage. They showed no recognition, no emotion, but their presence confirmed her words. "And you 17, she continued, her black gaze sweeping the bus. "You come from poverty, from broken homes, from lives of struggle and hardship. Here you will never know want again. Here you will be part of something eternal and beautiful." Pablo Velasquez, despite being only 7 years old, spoke with startling clarity. "But we won't be us anymore, will we? We will be like them, empty and cold, and watching." The woman's smile faltered for just a moment. "Empty? Oh, sweet child, you will be fuller than you have ever been. You will contain multitudes. You will hold the memories and experiences of every child who has ever joined us." It was this revelation that provided the key to understanding what Iris had been unconsciously documenting in her notebook. The strange symbols and patterns weren't random. They were a collective memory, the accumulated experiences of 43 missing children being downloaded into her young mind. "The notebook," Delilah breathed, suddenly understanding. "Iris, show me what you have been writing." The girl held up her composition book, and Delilah saw that it was no longer just Iris's handwriting on the pages. Dozens of different hands had contributed to the record, different penmanship styles from different eras all blending together. Tommy Morrison's careful 1950s cursive mixed with Jenny Lake's flowery script. Billy Crawford's rough scrawl overlapped with the writing of children whose names weren't even on the metal plate. They were all there. Every child who had ever been taken by this place, their memories and personalities preserved in a collective consciousness that was slowly absorbing the 17 children of Bus. "Day 4 will bring the true awakening," the pale woman announced. "You will begin to remember lives you never lived, to know things you never learned. By day 5, you will understand why this is a gift rather than a curse. By day 6, you will actively participate in your own transformation. And on day 7, she let the words hang in the air, heavy with promise and threat. On day 7, you will take your place among us, and the cycle will begin again. Another bus will find its way here in another year or two, carrying another group of lost children who need saving." As night fell on day 3, the changes in the children became impossible to ignore. Their skin had taken on a subtle luminescence. Their eyes reflected light like an animal's, and their movements had gained an otherworldly fluidity. But more disturbing was the way their personalities were beginning to merge and blend. The Velasquez siblings spoke in harmony without meaning to. The Caldwell twins finished each other's sentences even when separated. Knox and Ezra, despite their age difference, began displaying identical mannerisms and speech patterns. They were becoming a collective, losing their individual identities as they gained access to the memories and experiences of every child who had come before. Only the promise they had made to Delilah seemed to provide any anchor to their original selves. In quiet moments, they would whisper their real names, their family members' names, details about their lives before the bus. These fragments of identity became talismans against the overwhelming tide of alien memories flooding their minds. Delilah herself was fighting the same battle. The serene acceptance trying to settle over her mind was seductive, offering relief from years of worry and responsibility. But every time she felt herself slipping, she forced herself to remember her own promise, to protect these children, to find a way home, to never stop fighting. On day 4, the watchers in the forest began to move closer. No longer content to observe from a distance, they formed a tighter circle around the bus, their black eyes fixed on the windows with an intensity that suggested anticipation. The transformation was entering its critical phase, and they were gathering to witness the final stages. The pale woman appeared again, this time accompanied by children who looked more recent than the others. Their clothes suggested the 1980s and early 1990s, and one girl wore a Walkman around her neck, children who had vanished within living memory of the current group. "These are your immediate predecessors," the woman explained. "They will be your guides and companions as you complete your journey. They remember what it was like to be human, and they will help you understand why that was such a limited existence." One of the 1980s children stepped forward, a boy of perhaps 12, wearing a Michael Jackson t-shirt. When he spoke, his voice carried the same haunting harmonics as the woman's. "I was Timothy Fletcher," he said, though he spoke of his human identity in the past tense. "I was angry all the time, always fighting, always in trouble. Here I found peace. Here I found purpose." A girl from the early 1990s joined him. "I was Amanda Price. I was afraid of everything. Afraid of school, afraid of people, afraid of my own shadow. Here, fear is impossible. Here, there is only certainty." They spoke with the serene conviction of the converted, their words designed to ease the final transition. But to Delilah and the children still clinging to their humanity, their testimonials were profoundly horrifying. These had been real children with real personalities, real fears and hopes and dreams. Now they were empty vessels speaking scripted reassurances. As day 4 progressed into day 5, the changes accelerated beyond the physical and psychological into something that challenged the very nature of identity. The children began experiencing memories that belonged to other people. Tommy Morrison's Christmas morning in 1951, Jenny Lake's first day of school, Billy Crawford's last beating from his father. But mixed with these borrowed memories came something else, flashes of the place itself, its history and purpose. They saw it as it truly was, not just a pocket dimension or supernatural trap, but a kind of living entity that fed on childhood innocence. It sustained itself by collecting children at the moment when their natural resilience and adaptability made them perfect subjects for transformation. The entity was ancient, predating human presence in these mountains. It had learned to adapt its lures to each era, appearing as a sacred grove to Native American children, a mysterious cave to early settlers, a modern school bus to contemporary victims. But always, it took children in October, when the veil between worlds grew thin and such transformations were possible. Iris, still fighting to maintain her sense of self even as her notebook filled with the handwriting of the dead, made a crucial discovery on day 5. Hidden among the collective memories flooding her mind was something the entity didn't want her to find: the knowledge of how previous children had tried to escape. Not all transformations had been successful. Some children had found ways to resist, to maintain enough of their original identity to disrupt the process. The entity had learned from these failures, had adapted its methods, but the possibility of resistance remained. The key was the promise they had made to remember. The entity fed on the complete absorption of identity, but as long as core memories remained intact, the transformation could be incomplete. Previous children had tried individual resistance and failed, but collective resistance, 17 children supporting each other's identities while sharing their strength, might be enough to break the cycle. As Day 5 gave way to Day 6, with only 24 hours remaining before their transformation became irreversible, Delilah gathered the children for what might be their final act of defiance. "Listen to me," she whispered, her voice barely human but still recognizably her own. "We are going to do something that's never been tried before. We are going to remember together. All of us, supporting each other, holding on to who we were and who we want to be." The children formed a circle in the center of the bus, their transformed features beautiful and terrible in the moonlight. As one, they began to speak their names, their families' names, their memories of home. The words became a chant, a prayer, a declaration of war against the entity that sought to erase them. Outside, the watchers pressed closer to the bus, their black eyes reflecting an alien alarm. The pale woman materialized beside the vehicle, her serene composure cracking for the first time. "Stop," she commanded, her voice losing its honeyed tone. "You are making a mistake. You are choosing suffering over transcendence." But the children continued their chant, their individual voices blending into something greater than the sum of its parts. They were creating their own collective consciousness, one based on love and memory rather than emptiness and control. As Day 6 ended and Day 7 began, the battle for the souls of 17 children reached its climax. The outcome would determine not just their fate, but the fate of every child who might be lost in these mountains in the years to come. The promise they had made was about to be tested in ways none of them could have imagined. October 15th, Special Agent Victoria Thorne pushed through the dense mountain underbrush, her FBI windbreaker catching on thorns as she followed the faint trail that her team's ground-penetrating radar had detected 3 days earlier. The Millbrook Valley case had been officially closed for over 2 decades, filed away with hundreds of other missing persons cases that had simply run out of leads. But the recent expansion of cell tower coverage in remote areas had picked up something impossible, a localized electromagnetic signature that matched the description of a night. "Agent Thorne, you need to see this," came the crackling voice of Agent Rivera through her radio. He was 50 yards ahead, part of the advanced team that had been mapping the anomaly for the past week. What Victoria found when she reached Rivera's position defied every law of physics and logic she had ever learned. In a clearing that shouldn't have existed according to every topographic map of the area, sat Boss 47 exactly as it had appeared on October 5th. The yellow paint was unfaded, the tires showed no signs of weather damage, and through the windows she could see figures inside. "How is this possible?" Agent Martinez whispered, joining them at the tree line. The veteran investigator had worked missing persons cases for 15 years, but nothing had prepared him for this. The bus appeared to exist in a pocket of preserved time. Morning mist clung to its windows despite the afternoon sun, and the very air around it seemed to shimmer with an energy that made the agent's equipment malfunction. Victoria's digital camera showed only static when pointed at the vehicle, and their radio communications devolved into unintelligible whispers. But it was what surrounded the bus that truly stunned the FBI team into silence. Arranged in perfect circles radiating outward from the vehicle were children, dozens of them, representing clothing and hairstyles from different decades. They stood motionless, their backs to the bus, facing outward like sentinels. Their skin possessed an otherworldly luminescence, and their eyes, when occasionally one would turn, reflected light like polished obsidian. "Jesus Christ," Rivera breathed. How many missing children cases are we looking at here? Victoria was already on her satellite phone, trying to reach the behavioral analysis unit. The implications were staggering. If these were all missing children from the past 70 years, it would represent the largest recovery of missing persons in FBI history. But the circumstances suggested something far more complex and disturbing than a traditional kidnapping case. As the FBI team established a perimeter and called for additional resources, they began to notice movement within the bus itself. Unlike the motionless watchers in the forest, the figures inside appeared to be conscious and aware. Through the windows, they could see faces, young faces that should have aged 27 years, but appeared exactly as they had in. It was Agent Martinez who first noticed that one of the figures inside the bus was watching them. A teenage girl with dark hair was staring directly at him through the window, her lips moving as if she was speaking. He approached cautiously, his training warring with the impossibility of the situation. The girl pressed her hand against the window, and Martinez could see her mouth forming words. "Help us." Inside bus 47, the same moment, Tamara Hutchinson had been watching the world beyond their prison for 27 years, waiting for this moment. The collective resistance the children had mounted on day 7 had not freed them from the entity's influence, but it had changed them in ways their captor had never anticipated. They had become something new, neither fully human nor completely transformed. They retained their memories, their personalities, their love for each other, and their families. But they also possessed abilities that transcended normal human limitation. They could communicate telepathically, could perceive the flow of time as a river they occasionally touched, and most importantly, they could influence the entity that held them captive. For 27 years, they had waged a silent war. Every time the entity attempted to lure new children into its domain, the 17 guardians of Bus 47 had found ways to interfere. They had redirected school buses that strayed too close to dangerous areas, had created equipment malfunctions that forced search and rescue teams to find lost hikers before the entity could claim them, had even influenced the dreams of children who showed signs of supernatural sensitivity. "They are here," Tamara announced to her companions. Though they had all sensed the FBI team's arrival, the ones we have been calling to, Delilah Rodriguez, still recognizably herself despite the ethereal changes the years had wrought, felt a mixture of hope and terror. They had spent decades learning to manipulate the electromagnetic fields around their prison, sending out signals that would eventually be detected by advancing technology. But contact with the outside world meant risking exposure of the entity to a world unprepared for such horrors. "Are we ready for this?" asked Knox Patterson, his 13-year-old face bearing the wisdom of 27 years of impossible experiences. "Once we make contact, there's no going back. The entity will know we have betrayed its existence." Iris McMullen, still clutching a composition notebook that now contained the memories and experiences of nearly a century of missing children, nodded gravely. Her young features had gained an otherworldly beauty, but her eyes held depths of knowledge that belonged to someone much older. "The world needs to know," she said simply. "How many more children will disappear if we don't act?" The pale woman who had overseen their transformation materialized beside the bus, her perfect features twisted with an emotion that might have been rage or fear. For 27 years she had struggled to understand how her perfect children had developed the ability to resist her commands while still remaining within her domain. "You cannot do this," she hissed, her voice losing all pretense of maternal warmth. "You belong to this place. You are mine." Maria Velasquez, who had spent nearly 3 decades protecting her younger brothers Pablo and Diego, stepped forward with a courage born of desperation. "We were never yours. We chose to stay, but not as your slaves. We stayed as guardians, to protect others from your hunger." The revelation sent shockwaves through the supernatural ecosystem of their prison. The entity had assumed that the children's resistance had simply delayed their complete transformation. It had never occurred to it that they might have consciously chosen to remain partially transformed in order to serve as protectors. "Every child you have taken," continued Maria, her voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself vibrate. "Their memories live within us. Tommy Morrison, Jenny Lake, Billy Crawford, they are all here, all aware, all helping us resist you. Your victims became your judges." Outside the bus, Agent Thorne watched in amazement as the scene before her began to shift and change. The motionless watchers in the forest started to move, slowly turning toward the bus with expressions of confusion and awakening consciousness. It was as if a spell that had held them in place for decades was finally being broken. Her satellite phone crackled to life with a voice she didn't recognize, young, clear, and impossibly speaking from inside the sealed bus. "Agent Thorne," the voice said, and she realized with shock that no one had told the children her name. "This is Iris McMullen. I have been documenting our situation for 27 years. You need to understand what you are dealing with before you try to help us." Victoria's hands shook as she held the phone. According to the case files, Iris McMullen had been 9 years old when she vanished. The voice on the phone sounded exactly like a 9-year-old girl, but spoke with the vocabulary and wisdom of a scholar. "Tell me," Victoria managed to say. "There are places like this one scattered across the country," Iris explained, her young voice carrying impossible authority. "Supernatural entities that feed on children's innocence and adaptability. Every year, hundreds of children simply vanish without a trace. Most people assume they are runaways or abduction victims, but many of them end up in places like this." The implications were staggering. If Iris was correct, it would mean that a significant percentage of missing children cases involved supernatural rather than criminal elements. The FBI's entire approach to such investigations would need to be reconsidered. "How many places?" Victoria asked. "We can sense at least 17 similar entities across the United States," came the reply. "Maybe more. Each one has its own method, its own hunting ground, its own collection of transformed children. But this is the first time any group of victims has managed to maintain enough humanity to make contact with the outside world." Agent Martinez had approached close enough to the bus to see inside clearly. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his career. 17 children, unchanged by 27 years, sitting in perfect preservation. Their eyes held depths of experience that belonged to ancient souls, but their faces remained heartbreakingly young. The youngest, a boy who couldn't have been more than 7, pressed his hand against the window and smiled at Martinez with a warmth that seemed to illuminate the entire clearing. Despite everything they had endured, despite the impossible circumstances of their captivity, these children had somehow maintained their essential humanity. "Agent Martinez," came another voice through Victoria's phone, this one belonging to a woman who must have been the bus driver. "My name is Delilah Rodriguez. These children have been heroes for 27 years, fighting a war that the world doesn't even know exists, but the fight is killing them slowly. They can't remain in this state forever." The entity's last stand. As the FBI presence grew stronger and more children throughout the forest began to show signs of awakening consciousness, the entity that had ruled this pocket dimension for centuries made its final desperate gambit. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in seconds, frost forming on the bus windows despite the October afternoon sun. The pale woman grew in size and terrible beauty, her perfect human facade dissolving to reveal something ancient and hungry that had never been human at all. Her voice, when she spoke, came from everywhere at once. The trees, the ground, the very air itself. "You think you can expose me to your world?" she roared, her words causing several agents to stagger and cover their ears. "I am older than your species. I have fed on the young of a dozen different civilizations that thought they could challenge me." But the 17 children of Bus 47 were no longer just children. They were the collective consciousness of nearly a century of victims, and they had spent 27 years learning to harness powers that the entity had never intended them to possess. Rising as one from their seats, they moved to the windows of the bus and placed their hands against the glass. Their combined will, focused through decades of love and protection, began to tear holes in the fabric of the pocket dimension itself. "You fed on our innocence," Tamara spoke for all of them, her voice carrying the weight of every child who had ever been lost to supernatural predators. But innocence, when it chooses to act, becomes the most powerful force in any universe. The Watchers in the forest, children from decades past, who had been trapped in mindless servitude, suddenly came alive with personality and memory. They turned toward the entity with expressions of recognition, and for the first time in decades, human emotion. Tommy Morrison called out the boy in the Michael Jackson t-shirt. "I remember my name. I remember my family." "Jenny Lake," whispered a girl in a 1950s dress. "I had a dog named Spot. I loved to read." One by one, the stolen children began to reclaim their identities, their memories flooding back as the entity's control weakened. The collective will of nearly 100 victims, focused through the conscious resistance of Biz 4717 guardians, began to overwhelm their captor. The FBI's discovery, as the supernatural battle raged in dimensions beyond normal perception, Agent Thorne and her team witnessed something that would change the Bureau's approach to missing persons cases forever. The pocket dimension began to destabilize, becoming visible to normal human senses for the first time in its existence. They could see layers of reality peeling away like old paint, revealing glimpses of other places, other times. Brief flashes showed similar buses from different eras, other groups of trapped children, and most shocking of all, other entities like the Pale Woman operating their own hunting grounds across the country. "Command, this is Agent Thorne." She spoke rapidly into her satellite phone, knowing that what she was about to report would sound like the ravings of a lunatic. "I need immediate contact with every FBI field office in the country. We have a national emergency that's been ongoing for decades without our knowledge." The battle between the entity and its former victims reached its crescendo as the boundaries between dimensions began to collapse entirely. The 17 children of Bus 47, still hand in hand at the windows of their prison, made a choice that would echo through supernatural communities across the world. They chose to sacrifice their own existence to seal the entity forever, ensuring it could never claim another child while simultaneously creating a beacon that would guide other trapped children toward freedom. As their combined life force flowed into the effort, each child took a moment to speak to the agents outside, their voices carrying clearly through the dimensional barriers. "Tell our families we never stopped loving them," said Ezra Hutchinson. "Tell them we chose to be heroes," added Maria Velasquez. "Tell them this wasn't the end. It was our beginning," whispered Knox Patterson. One by one, the children of Bus 47 began to fade, their forms becoming translucent as they poured their essence into a working that would transform the supernatural landscape of North America forever. But they didn't disappear entirely. Instead, they became something new, guardians who existed between dimensions, protectors who could reach any child in supernatural danger. When the dimensional storm finally cleared, Agent Thorne and her team found themselves standing in an ordinary forest clearing with no trace of the bus or its occupants. But in her pocket, her digital recorder had somehow captured 17 hours of testimony from the children, providing detailed intelligence about supernatural threats across the country. More importantly, similar clearings began manifesting near known missing children cases across the United States. FBI teams would arrive to find brief glimpses of other dimensions, other captive children, and always the faint voices of Bus 47's 17 guardians, providing guidance and support. The official FBI report, classified at the highest levels, documented the existence of supernatural elements in 23% of missing children cases dating back to A special task force was established to investigate these phenomena, equipped with new protocols developed from the Millbrook Valley case. But perhaps the most significant change was personal rather than procedural. Every agent who worked missing children cases began to report the same phenomenon. In moments of greatest desperation, when traditional investigation methods failed, they would hear young voices offering clues, guidance, and hope. The 17 children of Bus 47 had become something unprecedented in supernatural lore, protectors who chose to remain in the liminal spaces between worlds, ensuring that no child would ever again face such horrors alone. Epilogue, present day. In a small office in FBI headquarters, Agent Victoria Thorne maintains the Millbrook Valley case file as an active investigation, though its status has evolved far beyond traditional law enforcement. The file now contains correspondence from families of missing children dating back 70 years, each reporting the same phenomenon: dreams of 17 guardian angels who watch over lost children, voices that guide searchers to hidden locations, and an unshakable feeling that their loved ones are protected by something beyond human understanding. The Pale Woman and her kind still exist, but their hunting grounds have become battlefields where they face opposition from children who understand their methods and weaknesses. The supernatural predator's success rate has dropped dramatically, and several entities have simply abandoned their territories rather than face the collective will of their former victims. Every October 15th, Agent Thorne visits the Millbrook Valley site where the dimensional incursion occurred. The forest is ordinary now, but sometimes, if she listens carefully, she can hear faint echoes of children's laughter and the soft sound of a young girl's voice documenting wonders and horrors in a composition notebook that exists in dimensions beyond human perception. The 17 children of Bus 47 kept their promise. They remembered who they were, where they came from, and why they chose to fight. And in remembering, they became something the supernatural world had never seen before. Victims who transformed their suffering into strength, their imprisonment into protection, their loss into an eternal gift to every child who would come after them. The FBI's discovery changed everything, because it revealed that some disappearances aren't mysteries to be solved, but battles to be won. And sometimes the greatest victories come from those brave enough to choose transformation over surrender, protection over self-preservation, and love over fear. In dimension-spanning battlefields visible only to those with the sight to see them, 17 children continue their watch, ensuring that no child will ever again vanish without champions fighting to bring them home. The case of Bus 47 remains officially unsolved, but those who know the truth understand that some mysteries are more important as ongoing stories than as closed files. The children are still out there, still protecting, still remembering their promise to never stop fighting for those who cannot fight for themselves. And every missing child who finds their way home carries with them the faint echo of 17 voices, singing lullabies of courage in languages that exist only in the spaces between worlds.